Okay, thank you, Philip. I feel that Adam Usk is something of an old friend of mine. I first really got interested in him, I think more than 30 years ago, actually, when I started looking at chronicles of Richard II's reign. And I just found his particularly interesting, and I think I also felt that it was perhaps a slightly misunderstood chronicle. So I edited it, and that was published 25 years ago. And since then, to be honest, I haven't really done any new research on Adam Usk, although a few things I've come across a few things over the years. So it's not really new what I'm going to be telling you about today, but I do think that Adam Usk had a rather interesting life. So basically, I'm going to tell you about his life, and then a little bit towards the end, I'm going to tell you more about his chronicle. Adam Usk was, as I'm sure many of you know, born in Usk. He was probably born around about 1350. Local tradition has it that he was born in the castle gatehouse there. There is no more to that than local tradition, but the fact that Adam was, during his early life, occasionally known as Adam Porter might be thought to give some support to that idea. It's possible that his father was the porter in the gatehouse. Adam thought of himself as, to some extent, noble. Now, noble was a fairly flexible term at this time, but he had a sister he said he was related to some of the nuns in Usk Priory, and he described them as noble born, the nuns in Usk Priory. So anyway, that's we don't really know anything about his youth. The only thing he tells us about his youth, apart from the fact that he was born there in Usk, was that when he was a child, he witnessed the abortion of a two-headed calf in a place called Llancaio, which I'm sure many of you know, and I know it's close to Usk. But that is just about everything he tells us about his youth. But he was clearly an ambitious and talented young chap. And in about 1370, when he was in his late teens probably, he went up to Oxford. Now, of course, the only way that a young Welsh boy like him, or young man like him, could really go to Oxford was if someone patronized him. And that was the beginning, although, of course, the Mortimers did hold Usk, the lordship of Usk. And that was the beginning of his patronage by the Mortimer family, which was to be something which he was to enjoy throughout his life, although, of course, the Mortimers so frequently died young that very often that patronage tended to fail for years, even decades on end. Anyway, Edmund Mortimer, the Earl of March, sent him up to Oxford, gave him a scholarship to go to Oxford, and he probably went up there around about 1370, and he spent the next 25 years at Oxford, as he tells us in his chronicle. And he obviously did well, because he was a doctor of both laws, that doctor utriusque juris. He was a doctor of both laws by 1390. That meant both canon law and civil law. And in about 1390, and we can't be completely precise about dates because he doesn't tell us that precisely, in about 1390, he became a professor. He had what he calls a chair, a cathedram, at Oxford University. And he remained at Oxford University for the next 5 years, from 1390 or thereabouts when he got his chair, to about 1395. So he spent about 25 years at Oxford. He was clearly a very highly educated man, but his time at Oxford was not without some alarms. And he tells us about this in his chronicle. He tells us that in 1388 to 9, and this is substantiated by other records as well. It tells us that in 1388 to 9, there was a series of quite significant riots, and this was not that uncommon at Oxford, a series of riots between the Welsh, well, the Southerners and the Northerners, and the Welsh allied with the Southerners. So they were part of the Southern faction and there was quite a lot of violence. About 4 people were killed, and a lot of people were had up before a royal justice to answer for their part in these riots, and among them was Adam Usk. And this is the first section I'd just like to read to you. I have my copy of the Chronicle here. It's the first section I'd like to read to you. He says, but I'm quoting, "Having thus been indicted, it was only with great difficulty that we were set free by a jury in the presence of one of the king's justices." And then he goes on, interestingly, "Before this, I had lived in ignorance of the power of the king, but henceforth I feared him and his laws, and I placed a bit between my jaws." In other words, he says, from this time onwards, I decided to be a little bit more discreet about the way I behaved, because he didn't want to get in trouble with the king and his justices again. And that seems to me to be almost a metaphor, if you want, for his chronicle, because his chronicle is undoubtedly a chronicle with the author's bit between his jaws. There are certain things which he doesn't want to say, there are certain bits that he leaves out, and we have to try to fill in the gaps as best we can from other surviving sources of the time. Anyway, he was acquitted, and his career continued to flourish. And in 1395, he finally left Oxford, which he later described as that nest of heretics. And of course, Oxford was very much as it were, the spiritual parent of Lollardy. That was where John Wycliffe had taught, and it's perfectly possible. It's really much more likely than possible that during the 1370s he would have heard John Wycliffe regarded by the authorities as the great heresiarch of late 14th century England. He would have almost certainly heard John Wycliffe give lectures at Oxford. But he clearly wasn't influenced by Wycliffe's ideas on the church, because Usk hated heretics and everything to do with them. He was clearly never tempted to go down that path. Anyway, in 1395, he left Oxford and he went to work at the Court of Arches for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Court of Arches was the principal provincial, not just diocesan, but the principal provincial court. That is for the court for the whole province of Canterbury, as opposed to the northern province, the province of York. And that did encompass 17 out of the 21 bishoprics in England. So it was very close to the Archbishop's court for almost the whole of England. So he worked for several years at the Court of Arches for Archbishops of Canterbury, and he also at this time began to receive several crown commissions. He was quite clearly a rising lawyer at the time, a man who was in demand. He acted, for example, in the Court of Chivalry. He acted in the King's Bench for several nobles, knights, and so forth, who were pursuing various causes. And at this time, he also began to accumulate those livings. In other words, those benefices, which were so often held in pluralism by people like him. In other words, they would hold several benefices at the same time, but they wouldn't really appear in any of them at any time. He served 3 archbishops. He served firstly William Courtenay, Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in 1396. Then he served Thomas Arundel, who replaced him in 1396 as Archbishop of Canterbury. And Arundel, in fact, was to remain during the minorities of the Mortimers, who were really somewhat shackled by these minorities and couldn't exercise positive patronage. Arundel really remained Usk's principal patron for the next 20 years. and he has nothing but praise for Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury, whom he describes as Dominus Meus, my Lord, the man who promoted him, who patronized him, and later, as we shall see, forgave him. So everything was going fine for Usk. He was a rising man at court. And then in 1397 occurred the first of three major conflicts of loyalties, which were to afflict him for the next 5 years and really eventually to decide the course of his career. Because 1397 was Richard II's, who was of course king at the time, Richard II's so-called revenge parliament. And Thomas Arundel, the archbishop, it was a very bad parliament for the Arundel family, because Thomas Arundel, archbishop, was exiled from England because he was accused by Richard of being involved in the rebellion against the king 10 years earlier. So he was sent into exile, and his brother, Richard Earl of Arundel, Thomas Arundel's brother, Richard Earl of Arundel, he was tried for treason and executed during the course of the 1397 Parliament. So the Arundel family was in effect destroyed by Richard II, at least for the moment, in the 1397 Parliament. Now, at this point, Arundel could have chosen to go into exile with, Usk could have chosen to go into exile with Thomas Arundel, but he didn't. He chose to serve the man who is very widely referred to in documents at the time as the intruder. That is Roger Walden, the man whom Richard II had promoted or provided to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, having exiled Thomas Arundel. In other words, Usk chose to accommodate, but he did so discreetly. He never actually tells us in his chronicle that he served Walden, but it's actually perfectly clear that he did. And he said quite nice things about Walden without ever having admitted that he decided to abandon Arundel and serve him, which, was probably quite a reasonable choice. And one shouldn't really disapprove or condemn Usk too much for doing this. But 2 years later, in 1399, came the second conflict of loyalties for Usk. And this was really much more serious. And this was, of course, the deposition of Richard II, because Richard II, having destroyed his enemies in the Parliament of 1397, was then himself deposed, and Henry IV, Henry of Lancaster, who landed in England with only about 40 followers at the beginning of July 1399, but soon found that no one wanted Richard II as king anymore, and Henry IV deposed Richard II and took the throne for himself. Now that was quite clearly an event which was welcomed by Usk, because Usk intensely disliked Richard II. He thought he was a very poor king, and he actually, after Henry of Lancaster landed, he actually joined Henry IV's army and marched with him right up the March of Wales, just where you are, from Bristol right up to Chester, through those Marcher counties. And then Richard II was captured, taken to London and deposed. And of course, that also meant that Thomas Arundel, who was also with Henry IV at the time, or Henry of Lancaster, also meant that Thomas Arundel was restored as Archbishop, and Walden was unceremoniously dismissed from office. But this was a big dilemma for Usk. Now we know, because he tells us, that he was on the committee which decided what were the legal grounds for the deposition of Richard II. So he was deeply involved, personally implicated in the deposition of Richard II. But of course, his great patron was his patrons were the Mortimer family. And Mortimer, Edmund Mortimer, the 7-year-old Earl of March, because the previous Earl had died in 1394, the 7-year-old Earl of March was regarded by many people as being the primogeniture and rightful heir to the throne of England. So this was a difficult one for Usk, but once again, he accommodated. And again, you can't help thinking that he can hardly be blamed. It would have taken a very, very brave or almost suicidal doctor of laws to have objected to Henry IV's usurpation of the throne in 1399 and pointed out to him that this 7-year-old boy was really the rightful heir. But he does provide, he kind of compensates for this, although he clearly felt guilty about it, by providing a rather equivocal and actually very useful account of the revolution. Anyway, he accepted Henry IV, and he now served Henry IV as king and Thomas Arundel once again as Archbishop of Canterbury. And he continued to work in the Court of Arches for another 2.5 years after this. And the fact that he had adhered to Henry IV, the fact that he had acquiesced in the usurpation and so forth, brought him many rewards. And it's really during the next 2 years, 1399 to 1401, that Adam Usk was at the height of his influence. He was a crown lawyer. He had lots of important commissions. He was often at court where he spoke with the German ambassadors. He spoke with the Irish ambassadors who were, or the Irish archbishop who came across to talk to Henry IV, tell him to do something about Ireland. And he was also in a position at this time to obtain many favors for his friends and his relatives. And as befitted someone who saw himself as a rising man, as an important man in the world, an increasingly important man, he, in March 1401, began writing his chronicle. He also enjoyed many livings at this time. He was a multiple pluralist, but so were most people in his position. But he encountered 1 or 2 problems. And in particular, he was granted, or at least he thought he was granted, the church of Llandigwydd. I hope I've pronounced that more or less right. Llandigwydd, near to Carmarthen. But there was another man, a chap called Walter Jakes or Walter Ormany. He had aliases, Walter Jakes or Ormany, who thought that he was the rightful holder of the church of Llandigwydd. And so they both appealed to the Pope. There was apparently some violence, although we don't want to take this too literally, because he was accused on the 3rd of November 1400, he was accused of ambushing Jakes at Westminster, stealing his horse and stealing his money. He was in fact later pardoned for this, and it's been argued by Professor Story that this was simply a false indictment by someone who wanted to besmirch Usk and thereby to regain the church which he thought was his. Anyway, it used to be thought that the reason why Adam Usk then subsequently, shortly after this, left England was because he was accused of horse stealing. That is quite clearly not the reason why Adam Usk left England. The underlying reason why he left England was because at almost exactly the same time, there came the 3rd major clash of loyalties, of Usk's loyalties. Because Usk was, of course, a Welshman, and I am quite convinced that at heart he was a Welshman. Suddenly, it was a great deal more difficult for Welshmen in England, because in September 1400, the revolt of Owain Glyn Dwr broke out, which of course lasted for about a decade. There was plenty of support for Glyn Dwr from scholars and from clerics, who then, of course, became suspect. and this included Adam. He rails in his chronicle about how people shunned him, how people were suspicious of him because he was a Welshman, and his chances of promotion were thereby diminished. And Usk was an ambitious man. He wanted a bishopric. He thought that he was due a bishopric by this time, and he was a perfectly plausible candidate, you know, from the point of view of his career, his CV up until this time. He was a perfectly plausible candidate for a bishopric. But he decided, given all the animosity against Welshmen at the English court and in England more generally, that the best way to try and get a bishopric was to go to Rome. Now, this was quite common. This was something which almost invariably infuriated English kings, because ambitious clerks would go to Rome, and then when news came through to Rome that another English bishop had died, or a Welsh bishop had died, then they would plead with the Pope. They were on the spot. They would say, I can do that, you know, provide me to this bishopric. And they would, in effect, get in ahead of the king or the chapter, the cathedral chapter's nomination. So this was really quite a common way for Englishmen to gain bishoprics, and that is quite clearly what Adam Usk went in order to do. So he decided he was going to go to Rome, and he left England on the 19th of February, 1402, as he tells us, leaving from Billingsgate. And in fact, as it turned out, he would not return to England for another 9 years, which was most definitely not what he had planned. He arrived in Rome on the 5th of April, 1402. He tells us all this in his chronicle. And within a month, Usk had been appointed a papal chaplain and a lawyer, a papal lawyer. And he continued to hold these positions until 1406, for 4 years. He remained in Rome for 4 years. But he was clearly regarded by the English at Rome as untrustworthy from the start. And we have a letter. This is the second extract I want to read you from Usk's chronicle, which is that the right? Yes. He said, this is a chap called William Lovell, who was an English clerk at the court of Rome at this time. And he said, where's it gone to? Where's it gone to? Oh, yes. He says, Lovell is writing to his friend at the English court. He said, there was a problem which was being sent to him. He said, I had pondered within the secret places of my heart what ought to be done about the aforesaid. Since Lord John Tyre is dead, and Lord Adam, and this is Usk, and Lord Adam, albeit that you wrote to him, is reckoned amongst us all, on account of his words, to be in some degree not quite faultless in relation to Owain Glyn Dwr. And therefore we do not communicate with him openly about this or any other matter. So this is, I mean, apart from Usk's own comments about the way he was shunned by the English in Rome, this is actually the principal piece of evidence that we have that he was indeed suspected of having sympathy with Glyn Dwr at this time. So he was regarded as untrustworthy from the start, and he compounded his own problems by his episcopal ambitions. In 1404, 3 bishoprics came up for grabs. 3 bishops died, all within what Usk might have thought of being his orbit: the bishopric of Hereford, the bishopric of St. David's, and the bishopric of Bangor. And on each occasion, he tried to have himself appointed. He tried to persuade the Pope, but he said his enemies in England got in his way. They spoke, and his enemies in Rome as well, the English at Rome, they spoke against him. They told the Pope not to promote him because he was untrustworthy. And on each occasion, he was thwarted. Of course, it's possible that I mean, Adam tells us a lot about this, about how the English at Rome thwarted him and the English in England thwarted him. It's possible that he was not considered really quite up to the standard required for a bishopric, but that's obviously not what he said. But all this aroused the fury of Henry IV, because there was this character, this very ambitious character at the court of Rome, trying to put a spanner in the works each time a bishopric came up, and Henry IV had to make sure that his man was chosen. Anyway, he was increasingly shunned at Rome, and by 1406 he was bankrupt and he was humiliated. But an alternative beckoned. This was, of course, as many of you know, the period of the Great Schism. The Great Schism in the Western Church, which lasted from 1378 until 1417, when there were two popes, one at Avignon, to whom half of Europe, more or less, paid allegiance, and one in Rome, to whom the other half of Europe, including England, paid their allegiance. In the so-called Penal Declaration of March 1406, Penal near Machynlleth, in the so-called Penal Declaration of March 1406, Owain Glyn Dwr, who was at this time pretty much at the height of his power, possibly just a little bit past the height of his power, made an alliance with the French. And as part of this alliance, he switched the Welsh church, the allegiance of the Welsh church, from the Roman Pope, which, as I say, it was the one which the English acknowledged, to the Avignon Pope. So Usk thought, I'm not going to get a bishopric here. Everyone's talking against me every time I try. So he thought he might try his luck with the Avignon Pope. And this must have been based on a calculation that there was a real chance that Wales would become independent. Because, as I say, this was just a little bit round about the time of the height of Glyn Dwr's power and the greatest success of the Glyn Dwr revolution. So on the 11th of June 1406, he left Rome and he went to France. And the next 2 years, 1406 to 1408, were the pivotal years in Usk's life. Now let's look first at his own explanation. This was that he wandered through France and Flanders for 2 years, 1406 to 1408, practicing as a lawyer. Now, the first thing you have to say is that if he was going to practice as a lawyer in France, which acknowledged the Avignon papacy, he would almost certainly have had to acknowledge some sort of allegiance to the Avignon papacy rather than the Roman papacy. He then says that he went to Bruges in Flanders, where he met the Earl of Northumberland and Thomas Lord Bardolph, who in the previous year had rebelled against Henry IV and had been driven into exile. And he decided, they suggested to him that they were going to go back, to England to try to successfully effect a revolution against Henry IV and depose him. And this is how Usk reports his conversation with them. And he said, and because I was frequently in contact with them, that is Northumberland and Bardolph, this was while he was in Bruges, and because I was frequently in contact with them, King Henry was stirred to even greater fury with me when he heard about it. Eventually, the Earl, that is Northumberland, was persuaded to return to Scotland and thence to England through treachery, for counterfeit seals were used to make it look as if he was being promised the kingdom of England for himself. And he promised me, that is Usk, he promised me promotion to high office if I went with him. But God visited my heart, and I thought, Adam, you are in a labyrinth. Put your trust in God. And then God sent an evil spirit between the king and the earl, and rightly so, just as he did with Abimelech, this sort of thing that Usk loves doing, biblical comparisons, as we read in the book of Judges. And so I turned my coat and I decided to make my way to my Lord of Powys. That is, we'll come on to the Lord of Powys in a minute. Hoping, if God willed it, for a pardon from the king and the kingdom. And so it came to pass. Well, that is Usk's description of what he did. So he decided not to return to England, which was very lucky because Northumberland and Bardolph did invade England again in 1408. They were both killed, and so were most of the people, quite a number of the people who went with him. However, Usk was still outlawed and excommunicated and deprived of his livings. In other words, he was persona non grata. And in fact, there was good reason why he was, which Henry IV knew about, but Adam chose not to mention in his chronicle. The good reason was, and Henry IV discovered about this in the summer of 1407, because Usk went to Avignon, and in May 1407, he was made Bishop of Llandaff by Pope Benedict XII, the Avignon Pope, who of course had no authority in England, but Usk obviously still thought that at some point Wales might become independent, and then he really would become Bishop of Llandaff. Well, Henry was absolutely furious. Once again, he was excommunicated, and he was told, if you come back to England, you will be put to death. He was not just a traitor, not just an excommunicate, but he was also a traitor. So not surprisingly, Adam decided to stay abroad. But things at that point got worse. The tide began to turn from about 1407 onwards. So that's pretty bad timing by Usk when he went to Avignon. The tide began to turn against Glyn Dwr. All Henry IV's friends seemed, enemies, all Henry IV's enemies seemed to be, well, the Duke of Orleans, who was his great enemy in France, was assassinated in 1407. And then came the invasion by Northumberland and Bardolph. They were captured at the Battle of Bramham Moor in 1408. The coalition against Henry IV was collapsing, and the dream of an independent Wales under Glyn Dwr was vanishing. And really, the only option open to Adam now at this point was to beg for a pardon. So in the summer of 1408, he met a man called Richard del Brugh, who was entitled, he was empowered to speak on the king's behalf. He met him at Bruges. He was the Lancaster, he was one of the heralds, he was the Lancaster King of Arms. And he struck a deal with Richard del Brugh, the Lancaster King at Arms. And this is how Usk describes the deal in his chronicle. Richard del Brugh said, there was no way I could be pardoned at the present time. On the contrary, the king's anger with me was increasing every day. So I, this same compiler, therefore swore an oath to this king at arms, that I would pretend to be one of Owain's supporters, and that I would take my men and make my way to Wales to join him, but that once there, I would, when an opportunity presented itself, secretly slip away from him and go and stay with my Lord of Powys, hoping thereby to gain the king's pardon. And that is what happened, and it was this promise which saved my life. So that is Adam's, well, let's be blunt, that is Adam's way of describing how, having already become a traitor to the English king, he now became a traitor to the cause which secretly he espoused, that is the cause of Owain Glyn Dwr. Because really, there's only one way to interpret that, which is that he agreed to become a spy. He agreed to become a spy and to spy on Glyn Dwr and report back to Edward Charlton, who would then, of course, report back to King Henry IV. And the deal was that if he did this, he would get a pardon. And that is, as he says, precisely what happened. He went to Wales, he joined Glyn Dwr. After a little while, the Welsh began to get a little bit suspicious of him. And so, after a year or two, and he doesn't say how long, he slipped away by night and he joined Edward Charlton. Edward Charlton, who was the Lord of Powys and who was married to the widow of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, who had died in 1398. A year after Roger Mortimer's death in 1398, his widow married Edward Charlton. And so here again was a really important Mortimer connection for Usk. And Charlton was the man who, in effect, agreed to try to save Usk. He spent 2 years, Usk says he spent 2 years as a chaplain at Welshpool. That must have been 1409 to 1411. He said he was poorly paid and in constant fear of his life, presumably from those people who knew that he had betrayed Glyn Dwr. But eventually, on the 20th of March, 1411, his pardon came through, which he said was secured by Edward Charlton and by a man whom he calls that most excellent man, David Holbach, who was a burgess of Shrewsbury and Oswestry, and some of you may also know him as the founder of Oswestry School. And so once he had his pardon, Adam returned to England. And Arundel, Thomas Arundel, his old patron, who was still Archbishop of Canterbury at this time, was forgiving towards him. He restored him to the Court of Arches, where he once again acted as a lawyer. He sat in Parliament in 1413, but sadly, well, certainly sadly for Usk, and obviously sadly for Arundel, Arundel died in February 1414. He writes a very fulsome tributary for Arundel. He describes him as the strength, lamp, and wisdom of the people, the light and delight of church and clergy, and the unshakable pillar of the Christian faith. He who conferred upon me the fine churches of Kemsing in Kent and Merstham in Surrey, with the prebend of Llandigwydd, which we've mentioned before, in Wales, and through whom I was hoping to be promoted to greater things, as indeed he had promised me. But this was a body blow for us, the death of his most influential patron. And Usk was now in his 60s, and this was really the effective end of his career. He lived until 1430. He still had some hopes. For example, in 1418, he was still trying to get the bishopric of Bangor, but once again he failed. He gained some new livings. He continued to write his chronicle until 1421, but he was no longer really a figure of consequence. And by 1429, when he must have been very close to 80, he was described as suffering from long-standing incurable infirmities. And he may at this time have become a Corodian, that is, living in the monastery of St. Augustine's at Bristol. He made his will at Usk on the 20th of Jan, 1430, and he died within the next 2 months. He left many bequests. His will shows the strength of his local attachments. For example, he left bequests to the Vicar of Usk, to every nun of Usk Priory, to Llandaff Cathedral, which perhaps he still, in a funny way, thought of as his cathedral, to the friars of Cardiff and Newport, and he asked to be buried in the church of Usk before the statue of the Virgin Mary, who was always to him his most important saint. His grave, and I have been to Usk Church many, 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 many years ago, when the vicar was a man called R. Davies, who very kindly showed me around. I don't know if he's by any chance still vicar, but he's probably buried in the Lady Chapel, and it is marked by a memorial brass strip, which is now affixed to the choir screen. And I'm sure that many of you will have seen that. And for a long time, this is in Welsh, for a long time, the Welsh of this memorial plaque rather defeated almost all attempts to translate it. But then in 1921, Professor Maurice Jones supplied a translation which seems to be subsequently widely accepted. And it's very probable that Usk himself had a hand in the composition of these few lines which mark his memorial. And if that's the case, you can kind of see what matters to Usk. after fame, to the tomb from on the bench, the most skilled advocate of London, and judge of the world by gracious privilege. That means a papal auditor. They were kind of described as judge of the world. Judge of the world by gracious privilege. May the heavenly abode be thine, good sir. Lo, a Solomon of wisdom, Adam Usk, is sleeping here. Wise doctor of 10 commotes, behold a place full of learning. So, as I say, you can kind of see what mattered to Usk. His erudition. He was not a man who wore his learning lightly, absolutely not. He loved to emphasize the great learning, the education that he had had, and his legal expertise. There is, of course, no mention here of his trials and disappointments, of his betrayal of Glyn Dwr, of his failure to get a bishopric, or any of the things that went wrong with his life. Now, he also bequeathed in his will to a man whom he described as his kinsman, Edward ap Adam. He left what he describes as my book called Polychronicon. In other words, that is his chronicle. It is the Polychronicon of Ranulph Higden, which I'm sure many of you know. It was the most widely read universal history in England in the late Middle Ages, from about the 1340s when it was written. There are, I think I'm right in saying, about 150 surviving manuscripts of the Polychronicon, which is really a pretty strong indication of just how widely read it was. Anyway, Adam Usk's chronicle was written as a continuation of the Polychronicon. So the Polychronicon, well, Ranulph Higden died in the 1340s. There was a standard continuation, more than one actually. The standard continuations up to 1377. One of those was appended to Higden's Polychronicon in Usk's copy, and Usk himself continued the Polychronicon from 1377 until 1421. That is what is called Adam Usk's chronicle. It's actually technically Adam Usk's continuation of the Polychronicon, but that doesn't matter. It is in effect an independent chronicle. It is also the main source of information for Usk, although there are, because he was quite a well-known and quite a prominent character, he also does feature quite regularly in both governmental and episcopal records. But his Polychronicon is also a very valuable source for history, especially for the years from about 1397 to 1402. But I have to say that the most interesting thing to me about Usk's chronicle has always been what it tells us about the mentality of the learned mind in late medieval England. And I only want to spend, I'm not going to spend more than 5 minutes talking about this, and then I'll stop. But I want to give you a flavor of what I mean by that. There's no doubt that Adam was a man who was very well formally educated, 25 years at Oxford, doctor of both laws, etc. But what comes through really in his chronicle is his view of how to write history. Because his chronicle is one of those, and it's very far from being the only one, it is full of what we might call supernatural occurrences, but which perhaps are more precisely described as supranatural occurrences. In other words, it is full of prodigies and portents and prophecies and miracles and horoscopes and dreams and all those things which, you know, in Usk's chronicle, these things are clearly not just curiosities. That is not why these things are inserted. They're not just funny things that happen, like, you know, calves that get aborted with 2 heads and so forth. These are not just curiosities. These are vital to an understanding of the world and of the course of history. Because what these portents and prodigies and prophecies and miracles and so forth reveal is God's plans for the world. Now, it may be that as a Welshman, Usk was particularly interested in these things, because the Welsh certainly did indulge, the medieval Welsh did indulge a great deal in prophecy, and there seems to have been a lot of interest in things like portents and prodigies and so forth, but particularly prophecy in Wales, in medieval Wales. Possibly this has tended to exaggerate the importance which Usk attaches to these sorts of supernatural occurrences. I could actually quote you dozens of examples. There are many, many dozens of examples of these sorts of things occurring in Usk's chronicle. Great events were almost invariably foretold, that is, triumphs, disasters, and so forth. But also much lesser events were foretold. For example, Usk's fortunes. Usk's viewpoint was that the historian had a duty to record these portents, these signs, because they were, or at least they might be, guides to the future. And I just want to read you, this is the last extract I'm going to read you. I want to read you one example, just to illustrate how Usk thought that a serious historian ought to tackle the task of writing history. And this is from the spring of the year 1400. And the passage is as follows. So listen carefully to this. There's a little heading in it which Usk put in himself, the Battle of the Boys. During Lent this year, the apprentice boys of the City of London constantly banded together in their thousands to choose their leaders, during which they began fighting amongst themselves with all the fury of which they were capable. Many of them died as a result of this, being struck by blows or trampled underfoot or crushed in confined spaces, which made a lot of people wonder what this might portend. And the word which he uses there is prenosticare, what this might prognosticate, portend. And then he goes on, it was, I believe, the plague, which occurred in the following year, in which most of them were carried off from this life. Even so, it was not until the king had written to their parents and masters, threatening them in the strongest terms to put a stop to it, that they could be persuaded to desist from violence. Now, as I say, that's just one example from many dozens, which I could quote. But what we see here is a serious historian at work. This is how a serious historian ought to approach his task of writing history. What we see is a cycle of progressive fulfillment. One thing happened, on the face of it, this was just a riot between apprentice boys. But no, the serious historian must say, why? Why did this happen? What is the meaning? What is the meaning of this event? Because according to Usk, nothing just happens. Everything is, it is foretold by God, and it has a place in God's plan for the unfolding of the universe. The task of the historian is not just to record events, but to try to elucidate the meaning of events. And of course, it's not always clear what any event meant. In this case, Usk clearly had to wait for a while and say, well, yes, well, it must have been the plague which happened in the following year. That was what this battle between the apprentice boys was foretelling, or portending really, rather than specifically foretelling. It was up to the historian to ask, what did this event signify? Things don't just happen. It is taken for granted that everything ultimately revealed God's unfolding plan for the universe. And this, as I say, is the worldview of a very highly educated man. This is not some nutter coming from left field. This is a very highly educated man. And as I say, this is how, according to Adam Usk, you should approach the task of writing history. And he was not alone in thinking that. Thank you. Finished.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's been a fascinating insight into the ways in which an Oxford-educated cleric navigated the treacherous politics of the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries and the early part of the 15th century.
An Oxford-educated Welsh cleric.
Oh well, I was going to add, but from the ambiguous terrain of the marches, of course,
yeah,
and therefore a sense of dual nationality as well, because of course that I'm going to come back to this in a little while, because of course it raises fascinating parallels with our talk in 2 weeks' time. Because of course the other element that you've talked about is the insights into the minds of a medieval historian. And so in both respects, there are parallels with the talk that Georgia Henley will be giving in 2 weeks' time.
Oh yes, I know Georgia, yeah.
On Gerald of Wales.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a man who was proud of both his Marcher heritage and his Welsh heritage, mm-hmm. and tried to reconcile those two. But also as an author and historian, had a very similar approach and beliefs as Adam that you've articulated in relation to Adam. We can now just sort of enjoy sort of questions and discussions. So one from Natasha. Can you see the chats, Chris?
Yes.
So more a comment than a question. Other chroniclers such as William of Malmesbury and Ralph of Coggeshall. Oh, sorry, it's just jumped off my screen. Scroll back up. Included super and opera natural anecdotes in their works.
They did indeed. So do many other chronicles, and so do many other chroniclers. And in a sense, I mean, thank you, Natasha, for that comment. I mean, all I can really add to that is that it kind of bears out what I was saying, that this is seen as the way in which a serious historian approaches the task of history in the Middle Ages. I don't think there are, I mean, I know the chronicles of the later Middle Ages much better than the 12th century chroniclers. But I don't think there are many people who make it quite as explicit as Adam Usk does. That, you know, he is constantly looking in every event, whether it be, I mean, really quite normal events. You know, there's nothing really supernatural or supranational about, you know, a bunch of apprentice boys beating each other up in London. But, you know, it's still part of God's unfolding plan for the world, and therefore it has to find its place. Its significance has to be elucidated. So, yeah, I don't know if Natasha wants to come back on that, say anything more about that, but.
They were just the first two that came to mind.
Yes, yes.
I worked on a little bit, and who I knew included stories of revenants and all these, the sort of fairly standard fare. But yes, I don't know, as you say, if they consider them to be prognostications. I think they're just interesting things that people have told me have happened. It is more the way certainly Ralph of Coggeshall seems to frame them, from what I can see.
Well, yes, that's interesting. I'm often skeptical about thinking that medieval chroniclers simply include things. I mean, sometimes there are just you know, interesting things that happen, quite obviously. But I just think they have this mindset which we are rather alienated from nowadays. This way of thinking about that you know, I mean, you know, almost everyone in the Middle Ages, you know, believes that God has a plan for the world.
Absolutely, yes.
And that what we see happening in the world, everything that happens in the world, is revealing of the unfolding of this plan. And therefore, that everything that happens must have a place in that. Now, some took that further than others, and some took the task of trying to elucidate these happenings more seriously than others. But I just think that was in the backs of their minds all the time.
Oh, absolutely. I think God, purgatory, all those things were central to the medieval, God, awful word, mindset.
Yeah.
It was there. in everybody's thinking almost all the time. So whether or not they just didn't know why these events were happening, so they didn't go any further, or because they were leaving it to the reader to puzzle it out for themselves, or yes, they certainly included them for a reason. Was it just because it was interesting, or was it to make people think, perhaps?
Yeah.
Because these revenants are usually people who've done awful things while they're alive and then can't rest in their graves, so the corpse gets up and wanders about and does dreadful things. So it's another way. It's like the legends of the 3 living and the 3 dead. It's saying, don't do as I did, behave and you'll escape my fate. So I think perhaps that's part of the function of these stories, to make people consider their own behaviour, perhaps.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
It begs that then begs the question, Chris, when do we begin to see this falling out of late medieval chronicle historical writing?
Yes. I mean, I think not really until the 17th century. I mean, if you look at the matter of Britain, the Arthurian romances and so forth, Geoffrey of Monmouth and all those prophecies and whatever, they are still being repeated in the 17th century and being taken as, I mean, there's always been, there was skepticism from some quarters about Geoffrey of Monmouth from, almost from the time that he first wrote. What is it? Isn't it Gerald of Wales who has that story? I'm sure someone can remind me if this is correct. But if the devil tells lies, you put St. John's Gospel on his chest, and that would stop him telling lies. But if you put Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Britonum, the lies just flow out. And William of Newburgh, of course, described him as described the Historia Regum Britanniae as just a complete load of nonsense. So there was skepticism from the start, but then it's remarkable how these stories go on and on and on, getting repeated and apparently believed, accepted. There was no alternative early history of Britain. There was no other story of Britain before the arrival of the Romans. And, every nation wants an origin myth. So this was the story of Britain before the Romans came.
And which of course aided the Mortimers and the Yorkist family.
Indeed.
As through their descent from Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, through his daughter Gladys Lee, they were able to tie into the genealogies that led back to King Arthur and Cadwallader.
Yeah. I think actually, well, you're definitely right about that, Philip. I was just thinking about my answer to your question, which was a bit oblique. I sort of moved it on to Geoffrey of Monmouth and the matter of Britain, but I mean, I think that kind of mindset is still around in the 17th century, but I think it changes after that.
Right. Okay. So just changing topic, there's a question from Jules. Thanks for a fascinating talk. Is there any evidence during his alliance with the Avignon papacy that Adam was in contact with the Glyn Dwr administration back in Wales?
No, there's a simple answer to that, which is no, but you assume that Benedict XII at Avignon probably had some, I mean, there was the penal agreement. You assume that Benedict XII probably had some kind of communication with Glyn Dwr about the appointment of Adam, but there's no evidence of that, I'm afraid. I mean, Glyn Dwr did have an administration. He summoned parliaments and so forth, and he had a chancellor, and whatever. But we actually know very, very little about his administration. There are no registers of his writs or anything like that.
Right.
So I'm afraid the answer to Jules is it? Yes, sorry, Jules. Yes, I mean, I'm afraid there is just no evidence either way about that.
Okay. So the next question is from Gareth Jones, who I should perhaps just mention to you, Chris, is the secretary of the Glyn Dwr Association, and of course we have a biographer of Glyn Dwr listening, Griffith Aled. So how accurate can Adam's account of Glyn Dwr's campaign be when he was on the continent from 1402 to 1408? How did he get his information?
Okay, well, the first answer to that question is that he didn't write his account of the years 1402 until 1414 until 1414. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but he wrote the first half, more or less, of his chronicle before he went to Rome. He did not take his Polychronicon with him, so he left it, presumably with a friend or relative. We don't know who. But then when he came back in 1414, he began to write it up again. And it's very obvious that the section that covers the years from 1402 until 1414 is written partly from memory. He anticipates events the whole time. He's not pretending that not pretending that he's trying to write contemporaneously or anything like that. He anticipates plenty of events, and he must have picked up some information for those. He probably heard some things at Rome. I mean, he would have heard about how well Glyn Dwr was doing in 1404, 1405, which presumably influenced his decision to go to Avignon. So he must have picked up some information. He then must have picked up information when he was in Wales, when he went to Glyn Dwr's to pretend to be one of Glyn Dwr's men. And then he picked up more information after he went back to England. So this is all the information that he had accumulated by the time that he started writing his chronicle again in 1414. So how accurate can Adam's account of Glyn Dwr's campaign be? I mean, it's not, in no way was he trying to write the story of Owain Glyn Dwr. Therefore, there are massive holes in any biographer, and I'm delighted to hear we've got a biographer of Glyn Dwr here. Any biographer of Glyn Dwr will undoubtedly use Adam Usk's chronicle, but he or she will get a tremendous amount more information from all sorts of other sources. I would not call him the best chronicler of Glyn Dwr's rebellion, although he's an important one because he does provide incidental detail which other chroniclers don't mention about things like battles at Usk and so forth. Plenty of stuff there. So I hope that's a sufficient answer to your question, Gareth, but it's a very good question, how indeed. But the answer is he didn't learn about it while he was on the continent. Although, well, he might have learnt about it, but he didn't write about it. And what he wrote about it was influenced by what he learnt over many years later.
Okay, so Helen has said, yes, it was good to meet you in Nottingham.
That was a few years ago, about 15 years ago, Helen, something like that. Yeah.
The question is, thanks for a really interesting talk. If Adam was reviled for being Welsh during the Glyn Dwr rebellion, how far could that have been because of his patronage by the Mortimers as well?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that to be patronized by the Mortimers made you, I mean, Henry IV took a very interesting attitude towards the Mortimers. Actually, I used this as the title of one of my talks to the Mortimer History Society about 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember. And that was, don't mention the Mortimers. No one in Henry IV's reign dared to mention the Mortimers. And, you know, I mean, Henry IV just pretended, and of course, you know, it was completely a pretense. He just pretended not to have noticed that Edmund Mortimer had a claim to the throne. I think anyone, well, I mean, I know, you know, look at what happened with the Percys. Anyone who said, you're not the rightful king, Edmund Mortimer should be king, was, you know, carving out a route to the gallows for themselves. That was just suicidal to try to do that. So, but I don't think, I don't think Adam Usk could possibly have been stupid enough to try to emphasize his Mortimer patronage. That is really why, from the time, you know, after, particularly after Roger Mortimer dies in 1398, it is Arundel who is his chief patron. It is Arundel is the man to whom he looks for promotion and patronage. And possibly reviled is putting a little bit strongly. I mean, he was suspected, he was shunned by many people. I'm not quite sure if he was reviled because although he was thought to possibly harbour some sort of sympathy with Glyndwr, until he went abroad, there was no way he was going to do anything about that. And it was only when he went abroad and he didn't get his bishopric and he saw possibly a chance. And by the time he went abroad, Glyndwr's rebellion was still getting going. I mean, it was quite well developed by 1402. Well, by early 1402, I don't know. It had only just spread to the south by the winter of 1401 to 2. So I don't think that affects him that much. It's really the simple fact of his Welshness.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay,
thanks.
Right, and I'm taking that quote from you, Chris, of Henry IV's policy of don't mention the Mortimers as the theme for the editor's introduction to the book.
Yeah, right. Like Basil Fawlty, don't mention the war. Yes.
Indeed. Right. The next question, actually, I'm going to ask Griffith if he could turn his video on and unmute to save me stumbling over Welsh pronunciation there.
Oh, right. Yes, many thanks indeed, Chris, for a fascinating lecture, very interesting lecture. His Adam's epitaph in Usk Church appears to be an attempt to write what we call in Welsh cynghannedd, strict meter verse, but it's an attempt by someone who hasn't really mastered the technique, but it's nevertheless very, very interesting. I'm just wondering, perhaps, would Adam have been capable of writing his own epitaph?
Well, this has been much debated, and Maurice Jones discussed this. He came to the conclusion. Now, I do not know Welsh, let alone medieval Welsh, so you know I have to just take upon trust what those who seem to be the experts on the subject say. Maurice Jones thought that he probably had a hand in compiling his epitaph, but that probably he did not actually write it. Now, it may very well be that you know a lot more. You can answer your own question a lot better than me, because that's about as much as I can say. So it took a long time for anyone to decipher this thing. I have seen it. Reverend Davies, when I went to Usk Church sometime, it must be nearly 30 years ago. When I went to Usk Church, he showed me this thing, and it's wonderful. It's very beautifully kept and riveted to the choir screen there. I presume it still is. But it did defy translation. And I mean, it's in quite sort of squiggly handwriting as well, you know, very sort of italic, flowery handwriting. I'm sure you must have seen it, correct?
Yes. It is worth seeing, certainly.
And do you agree with the translation? I'd be interested to know, because I just don't know.
The orthography is very odd, but the translation, I think, is very good. Yes, I doubt it could be bettered. But I'm just wondering whether Adam himself did have a hand in writing it. Could I just come back to the previous point? The his closeness to the Mortimers. One interesting point, after he talks of the death of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March in 1398 in Ireland, he then has a passage which seems to be a virtual quote from the Wigmore Chronicle and the
University
of Chicago, which the fact that he was able to directly quote from that work certainly suggests that he was very close to the Mortimers.
Indeed, I agree entirely, and he was very close to the Mortimers, and he of course would have loved it if the Mortimers hadn't kept on dying at about the age of 25. You know,
Yes.
they would have been able to be much better patrons to him had that been the case. But he was very close. Actually, it was quite interesting, because when I realized how much he had relied on the Wigmore Chronicle for that, it rather made me think about the slight redating of the Wigmore Chronicle. But that's all sort of history that I did an awful long time ago when I was doing Usk's Chronicle. But yes, your comment is absolutely correct. He was very close to the Mortimers, and he was still serving the Mortimers, you know, until they died.
So he had a part in sort of burnishing the Mortimer family tree and reputation, and sort of pushing forward their claim to the throne in the final years of the fourth Earl's life before his death in Ireland.
No, I'm not sure about that. But he clearly does still have connections. I mean, he reports in 1415, I think. He reports that extraordinary story about which Ralph Griffiths is the only person who's really commented on, as far as I know. He has that story about a boy of 9 and a girl of 7 in the Welsh marches having a child. Apparently, well, I mean, I kind of did a bit of research on that kind of thing, and it's not the only time. It has been known, and you know, it seems extraordinary to us. And of course, most of the occasions when it happens are deeply unpleasant and not something you want to talk about. But this sort of thing can happen. And he presents that child, Edmund Mortimer. Now, this I'm sure is something which indicates that no one else mentions this. This indicates that Usk was still quite close to Edmund Mortimer at this time in Henry V's reign. He presents this child to Henry V. Now, Ralph Griffiths looked at that and he said, is he being ironic? Because Henry V was childless. Well, he was unmarried. He was unmarried and childless at this time. And is he kind of saying to Henry V, you better get on and have a kid? Because, you know, otherwise I might become king. Now, I'm not sure if Edmund Mortimer would have been stupid enough to say that, or to even imply that. But sorry, this is a little bit of a digression. But what I'm saying is this was clearly not a well-known story, and does indicate that he was still very much in touch with the Mortimers.
Yes, sorry, I was referring to the period in the late 1390s, just before the death of the fourth Earl.
Yes, he was, because in 1397 he and one of the fourth Earl's closest principal clerks, they together received money from the Exchequer to hand over to the fourth Earl. Yeah.
Because it was in that period when the Chicago version was being burnished, to enhance the Mortimer claim to the throne.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Right, and interesting, there's quite a lot of sort of just people generally saying they've got to leave, thanking us for an excellent evening and congratulating on the excellent talk. But in amongst those, I think there's one, at the moment, one final question, intriguingly from Jules. Chris, do you think Adam was very effective as a spy?
I haven't a clue. I mean, Adam is not going to tell us that he was a spy. He says he made this deal, but, you know, like several other, you know, little bits in his chronicle, he glosses over that sort of thing. I mean, he does say that the Glyndwr's followers became suspicious of him, but he doesn't say any more than that. And, you know, what was he meant to be reporting on? You know, where Glyn Dwr was this now? Was he meant to be going to? I mean, interestingly enough, of course, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. Was he meant to go and tell Edward Charlton, you know, Glyn Dwr is at the moment, you know, on that hill just above Welshpool, and you can catch him there? I don't know.
Yes.
If he was meant to, that obviously wasn't very effective.
I think it's very likely that he, after landing in Barmouth in 1408, I think he must have been in direct contact with Sir Edmund Mortimer, who was holed up in Harlech Castle at the time. He knows everything about his, you know, the children and so forth. I think it's very likely. But he has his bit between his teeth when to put him on that period. In fact, doesn't he? As you said, he doesn't say how long he spent there or anything. But no, that's very opaque, I think, that part of his account.
Yeah. It is. I mean, it is, you know, you can think of Adam's Chronicle as really one of the most autobiographical of chronicles. And it is. It's a very autobiographical. I mean, you know, and it's kind of fascinating for the way he just kind of slips in and out of his narrative the whole time. And, you know, it doesn't seem to be any kind of abrupt juxtaposition. Suddenly he's there again and then he isn't in his chronicle. But he gives a pretty wide berth to the truth sometimes. You know, like a lot of autobiographies, he doesn't want the nasty bits to show.
And that's probably as good a place as any to finish.